Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Looking Back to Look Forward, a quantitative and qualitative review of the past 20 years of K-12 education assessment and accountability policy. I'm Caitlin Cadell-Lowe, Vice President of Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I'm thrilled to be here today to unveil this report. I must admit, nearly 2 years ago when we embarked on this effort, this report wasn't necessarily on our mind, mostly because we thought surely this had been done before. We were about to observe the 20th anniversary of No Child Left Behind, so we thought what an opportune moment to take a look back at the last 20 years of federal education policy. To our surprise, or maybe shock, it had not been done yet. So for nearly the past 2 years, we at the Chamber Foundation have been hard at work on our Future of Data initiative, and we're proud to launch it today. We accomplished this by pulling together a phenomenal working group and hosting dozens of discussions. We made sure that to bring together smart people with differences in opinions, some of which you'll hear from today. Digging into research in order to discover what do we know about the last 20 years, and we spent hours interviewing many differing perspectives from the last 2 decades, which of course is the topic of today's webinar, and you will hear from Chris Stewart and Dan Goldhaber in a few minutes. We also hosted a design challenge asking what innovative solutions would you make to assessment and accountability, which we received submissions last month and will be narrowing down to the best 6 in the next few weeks. This work is critical. This report is a crucial tool for the field, especially now as we grapple with historic learning loss that has occurred over the pandemic. We want to make sure we understand the criticisms. We want to make clear we understand the criticisms. Families don't find assessment data information timely or useful. Teachers complain tests take too much time, and civil rights advocates are opening our eyes to the need for culturally relevant content for students. We want to see those concerns addressed while maintaining structures for holding public schools accountable. That's why we called the initiative the Future of Education Data. We also know that there have been simultaneous efforts going on right now, and we hope that our research and work that follows is complementary and not duplicative of those efforts. Today's webinar is a chance for experts who conducted our quantitative and qualitative research and some of our working group members to share what they hope we will all take away from this report. Today's panel is moderated by Cheryl Oldham, who served as on the working group and is the Senior Vice President of the Center for Education and Workforce at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation and Vice President of Education Policy at the U.S. Chamber. Cheryl's going to dig into some of the questions with this great panel, and of course, we'll save time for question and answer with the audience after. If we don't get to your question, we are happy to make sure it gets answered after today's session. Please feel free to email us at education@uschamber.com with any questions or inquiries related to this work. Thanks again for joining, and let's get started.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and thank all of you for being here with us this afternoon. I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then we'll get right into questions. I know that we might be having a little bit of technical issues. This is the world in which we live these days, right, for virtual events. So we hope that we've got everyone, but we will pivot as needed. So we've got on our panel today Dr. Dan Goldhaber, the Director of the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data and Education Research, or CALDR, at the American Institute for Research. Chris Stewart, the CEO of Brightbeam. Maya Martin Cadogan, the Executive Director of Parents Amplifying Voices in Education. And Dr. Ivan Duran, the Superintendent of Highline Public Schools in Washington State. Welcome to the panel. And it does look like we might have lost our friend Chris. So we are just going to charge ahead and hopefully we'll get him back. There he is. Yay. He's an important part of this conversation. So hopefully the technology gods are with us. I'm going to start. We're just going to go right in. We don't have a ton of time. For Dan and Chris, Dan, who conducted the quantitative analysis, and Chris, the qualitative, what were the top, I don't know if you can in 3 minutes each, the top line takeaways out of your research, and what surprised you, I guess, the most in your findings?
Great, and it's good to be with you all. Okay, top line findings in 3 minutes. I think the sort of top line finding when it comes to NCLB style accountability, and I should say we looked at accountability, we looked at that all the kind of federal initiatives, accountability, Common Core, school improvement grants, teacher evaluation. Top line finding on NCLB accountability is positive and particularly significant for mathematics and for younger kids and kids that were on sort of the accountability margin. So for instance, students that were maybe consequential for moving up in proficiency thresholds. And so to us, that suggests that incentives made a difference, and that in particular, schools were kind of responding in ways that were consistent with the theory of action around accountability. I should say that those outcomes are all based on test scores, but there's also evidence that high school graduation probability has been creeping up over the years. So it does not look like there are sort of negative effects on educational attainment either. In terms of some of the other federal initiatives, I mentioned Common Core, school improvement grants, teacher evaluation. It does not look like there's any, broad scale national positive effects, but quite a lot of variation across states that is arguably connected to the way in which states carried out those federal initiatives. Okay, so what was surprising? I think one of the things that was surprising is just how little infrastructure existed to evaluate large initiatives like that prior to NCLB. So there were some issues where it was just very hard to address questions because there was no counterfactual about the way that the world was before we had more regularized testing and regularized collection of data. I also think it's surprising how kind of baked in conclusions seem to be about whether a program worked or it didn't work. And there's not as much as you might think researchers would see when you're looking at sort of the nuance of the program, again, across for instance, different contexts. And then I think it's also interesting that just in the last couple of years, we are seeing an avalanche of research about the myriad ways that schools and teachers contribute to student achievement that go beyond test scores, and just thinking about how much of that is related to the data infrastructure that we see, and at the same time, how much backlash there is on testing and the use of test scores as a metric for measuring schools, even though while we don't think that tests are the be all end all, that there are significant relationships between how well students do on tests during their K-12 experience and how well they do later in life. Lastly, I would be remiss in closing if I didn't acknowledge my co-author, Mike DeArmond, who had an accident, so couldn't be with us today, but was a valued co-author in this work.
Thank you, Dan, for reminding me of that, and should have acknowledged him up front. Chris, hopefully you can, you're with us. Oh, good. I see you. How about you? A couple top line findings. What surprised you most?
I'm going to try and keep this to 3 minutes. I was getting my stopwatch on because I know how to go long. So I will say this, going into a project like this, first of all, it was an exciting project. Going into a project like this, the assumption on our part would be that we were going to hear a lot of pushback and negative sentiment about the topic. And there was some of that, but this is the headline here is that, things are mixed in this way. We had people that were both in our stakeholder group of folks that we were speaking with. We had folks that were able to articulate the benefits that they see that came out of the NCLB period and era. And we had people that were able to also articulate the downsides of that. Some of the top sides, some of the upsides of things that people saw were things like more visibility on students of color and the ability to pinpoint how they were doing in ways that we weren't able to do before we disaggregated the data. More focus for parents and school leaders on the evidence to prove that their children were not being particularly well served in the schools that they were in. Also, multiple people mentioned that they thought the proliferation of charter schools or new educational learning environments with more of a focus on outcomes and achievement for previously marginalized groups of students was also a good outcome. There was outcomes for teachers, being able to provide them with more data, more reliable information about their practice and their outcomes. That was also a big upside that we heard from a lot of folks. The one out of, we could go through many things that we heard that were upsides. The one across all of them is just really the improvement of data, the ability for school leaders, communities, just the public in general to have more access to real information about how students and schools were performing. Some of the negative stuff and the downsides, the things that you would expect to hear were the narrowing of curriculum and the idea that we created kind of like a proficiency-based testocracy that started rating schools and rating the performance of students in ways that tracked students, labeled students. There was lots of kind of downward sentiment around things like labeling and creating a culture of shame, a culture of blame, and the stress levels that caused for students, for families, for teachers, without a lot of answers of how to get out of that. There's also some talk around, instigating cheating and standardizing methods of teaching, and just a race to the wrong kind of goals for education. The surprising thing about it was who said what. So there were two things that I thought were surprising. One thing that I thought was surprising was that supporters of NCLB who are stalwarts were able to see themselves the long-term critiques and the unintended consequences, and they were very humble about it and open and not defensive about it. And that was really surprising that they were able to articulate some of the things that they would have went back and done differently. And the second one, I think I kind of touched on this already. Second surprising thing was the detractors, or the people that you would normally expect to be anti-NCLB, were able to articulate things that happened in their own lives or in their own local areas that were positives and that were benefits of the reforms that came out of NCLB. The last thing I'll say is there was this really big, important light bulb for me about the difference between national storytelling and place-based storytelling, because you have national narratives about NCLB that people repeat. You will tell the same story of a person in Austin and a person in Milwaukee and a person in Maine who have never met each other. And even if they didn't experience NCLB the same way because their state laws were different, they say the same things about it in some cases. And that is evidence of a national narrative that is not necessarily always rooted in lived experience. So I think where this gets complex is you need to start looking into stories about how actual people their lived experience was affected by NCLB based upon their own state laws, their own local areas. And I don't know that we teased all of that out, but it's a good through line to keep going with into the future.
That's so important and I'm so glad that you raised that point about the national narrative and the point of just I guess it's just encouraging that both sides, I think it's just evidence that, things aren't as black and white as we always want them to be, and we can acknowledge, the other side's position on things. I want to bring Ivan and Maya into the conversation and ask you all a bit of the same question. Anything that really sort of surprised you about the report in this work? Ivan, how about you first, and then we'll go to Maya.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I really appreciate this opportunity to be able to weigh in. And, I was a school leader when NCLB first kicked in. First, I was assistant principal, then a principal. And I just distinctly remember the shifts that happened within our own district as we started to think about what does this mean, for schools and for our learners. And, at that time, the district I was involved with, we just saw some really good work that was happening around progress monitoring and formative assessment. Really felt like we were ahead of so many other districts at the time in terms of knowing where our students were. And then as I saw the shift happen, it was just this shift to really just focus on what I consider learning to the actual assessment and really thinking about how our students were being prepared and getting ready for this big state assessment that was going to be coming forward. We were already used to having assessments on a yearly basis, but the shift to this accountability and with potential outcomes. And I really appreciate what Chris is saying around the labels, because that's one thing that I really remember when this shift happened. Because for me, it felt like we went from learning to all of a sudden accountability and focusing on kids doing well on test and these outcomes that really created a lot of stress and started to label a lot of different schools. And the school that I was involved with had quite a large number of second language learners and students of color, so we just felt a lot of pressure. And I remember seeing those initial outcomes around 14 years, what's this going to look like? We're going to be able to get all students operating at grade level, reading, writing, and computing and math, and just felt that pressure, And so going back and reading through this research, it just brought up a lot of that lived experience that I had. And I feel that, where we are sitting now is that we've made some great changes. I really appreciated that we focus on subgroups and really thought about all students. I really felt like that really brought us forward. Thinking about what we needed to do to be prepared was important, but it wasn't the end all be all. I really thought we lost some good practices around the learning that I feel like we're still trying to recover now, especially after the pandemic. Now we're kind of in a similar place of trying to figure out where we are, where do we need to go. So I really look forward to some of the conversations we're going to be having around the future use of data, because I believe data literacy is still an important thing that we need to work on. I still feel we're learning and growing in that space, but it's pretty amazing to think that over 20 years, as much as we've learned and grown in education, we're still in a place where we're failing a high number of students. We still have high level of segregation in our schools, probably even worse than what it was previously. And we have a lot of work to do to support all of our students so they can find success for their future.
Thanks, Ivan. Maya, anything that you found surprising in this work?
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. I think one of the things piggybacks off of what Chris talked about, and that was in terms of the data that you guys looked at, the federal government was really the focus of a lot of our accountability and statewide assessment decision making. And yet where the change really was, according to the research that you all did, was at the local level. And yet we don't really focus on the local level as much. And yet each of those stories, those leaders, those schools are where we really make a difference for kids. And so I think as we think about what the future looks like, one of the things that it really brought to my mind is how we need to make sure that those decisions about what accountability and assessments look like need to be localized, so that they're for the context of the people that are served in those communities, that we're making sure that we're bringing all of the different stakeholders into that conversation: teachers, school leaders, parents, students, community members, and that we're really thinking about accountability as something that is a part of a community being able to hold itself accountable to what it wants to see for its children. And I think that's a different way than what we did in the first set of reforms, right? I think we really thought about the first set of reforms top down from the federal government to the states, and states would then implement that locally. And yet I think what we're talking about now in this new iteration in the future is thinking about how do we do that bottom up, where states are giving communities the power to determine what that accountability looks like, but making sure that we have accountability because parents and families and communities want to be able to know how their students are doing.
Yeah. So important. I think some of you have touched a little bit on this in your initial remarks, but if anybody wants to chime in on the something really concerning about the research, Dan, is there anything that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. One is the degree to which it seems like, people think it worked or it didn't work, and you can pick your it in terms of any of the federal initiatives, and then kind of relatedly, sorry, what I mean by that is it's never like that. There are always questions about worked in given implementation, the context, worked for whom, and so I think there's a lot more nuance than exists in a lot of the discussion today. And then the related issue is that I am worried that there are places where we don't see whole scale positive benefits, like in terms of teacher evaluation, but we see that there are real bright spots. And I'm thinking of, evidence that comes out of DC public schools and Denver, that, when the reform is done, I think according to the sort of the theory of action around the reform, that there are real benefits. And yet I don't see much evidence that those bright spots are spreading. And that people are sort of using the information to say, hey, it looks like it's working over there. We ought to think about it here too. And so I think part of our embedded theory of action is that when localities do something well, that the innovation, positive innovation, will catch on and spread. And I guess I'm more skeptical that that is happening today than I would have been a decade ago.
Interesting. Chris, what about you? Concerning?
On that point, I think one of the most concerning things about it is that so many of these projects come out the other end with the final analysis being it's mixed. It's complicated, and education's always going to be that way. But the thing I said earlier about the local versus the national narrative, when we have this work didn't work binary expectation of research, it doesn't serve us well to know the difference between worked where and worked how for whom. So in some places like teacher evaluation or test-based accountability or whatnot, in some states it was clearly better than it was in other places. So the work didn't work binary is not actually the best way, I think, to look at very complex information. Some things clearly did help and push us forward in ways where the story is being told too little. And some things did not work in other places, for instance, where the implementation might have been the problem or the lack of other types of supports. But to have a yes-no binary about whether these things worked or not, I think leaves the public confused about, or maybe even a little bit nihilistic about trying anything.
Yeah.
Education is very experimental. You do try things, you implement, you fail or you succeed and you try again. But the it didn't work thing, I think, is really concerning for me, for the public, because eventually that leads to, well, nothing works and let's just count nothing.
And it also, that leads into that point you made about the national narrative. Once that national narrative around things didn't work sort of seeps in, not good, generally. Ivan, Maya, anything that was super concerning that you want to raise?
I'd say for me, the only thing is that, here we are almost 20 years later, and we still have pretty much a single test that's done on a yearly basis that really measures, how our state's doing, how districts are doing, how schools are doing, how students are doing. So even throughout this time, we still haven't had a lot of innovation in that space around the assessments. And really what it comes down to is just how much pressure and accountability that still falls upon schools and school districts, so that for me is probably the one piece that is still a deep concern for me. And I know there's spaces where there have been some changes with assessments, but it hasn't been at scale. And we definitely haven't experienced it here in Washington yet.
It's one of the things that we loved about this group. It's just the wide-ranging sort of feelings and opinions and perspectives brought to all of these issues. Maya, is there anything you want to share?
Yeah, I would say from the other Washington, D.C., one of the things that we've really heard about from every single parent is that they know that the number one intervention for their child in terms of their academics is a great teacher. And that comes across all throughout the report. And yet the report talks about how we really didn't put as much investment in teacher preparation programs. And I would add to that teacher pipeline programs as well, that aren't just about teaching teachers how to teach, right? But it's also about how to understand the cultural background of your students, how to build relationships, how to do family engagement. There are so many myriad parts of that role that I think are really critically important that we haven't done as great a job at focusing on. And I think while we're doing it now, because the pandemic has made it more of a crisis, the time to respond to things isn't when we're in crisis. And now we're kind of behind the 8 ball on that. And so that really gives me a lot of pause. I would say the other piece in here that I think is really important that I think is both good and I have concerns and worries about it is the piece that you guys talked about information. That's a number one thing parents want is more information about how schools are doing. And I think one of the things you talked about in the report that's so critical is that it's really about how to support schools. And I think yet the way we perceived of accountability and the way a lot of people talked about it was less about support and more about who was failing. We use that language all the time. It's so deficit based. And when you talk to families and communities, what they want to figure out is how do we make it better? And the report talks about how many Black and brown and low income families don't have the choice to move. So some of the decisions with information that wealthier or whiter families are making, like where they can choose a different neighborhood to live in, are not things that our families have access to. And so that information is powerful and important, but in doing that information building, we need to make sure that it's about how are we actually allowing us to support and buttress schools with what they need, all of the interventions, making sure they have the right funding streams. That was in this report in terms of, yes, we increased federal dollars, but we actually didn't increase the amount per student. It was just more money going to schools. That's not the same thing as schools that are serving more low-income students with greater number of needs are actually getting more money. That's a totally different question. And so there are real questions of equity that I think we have to dig into. And when we're thinking about how we're building informational power for families, we need to do it in a way that builds power and isn't always looking at the negative, but really allows us to support and build communities to be stronger.
Such great points, Maya. And I want to stick with you real quick. You lead an organization, a parent advocacy organization. And while when we think of these sort of, research reports is really important for the field, maybe, parents aren't necessarily always the intended recipient or audience, but we certainly hope that there are some things about this report that parents can take away. Is there anything that sort of stands out for you? Are there, one or two things that you think that they might be able to take away and act upon?
Yeah, our parents do policy and advocacy work, so they're going to eat this up. This is like bread and butter for what they do. I think one of the things is really around the funding question and equitable funding. We're not talking about just putting more money into the system, but how are we actually funding our students equitably? And that's what a lot of your research showed, is that when we're doing that in ways that we're giving more resources to kids who need more, we will see the impact of our investments. Of course, we're going to see the impact no matter what, but we have a lot of areas where we have concentrated poverty, and yet we're not concentrating larger sums of funding inside of those communities or schools. And so we really need to think about how we're doing that equitable funding piece. And that's been something our parents have been fighting for here in DC, is additional funding for at-risk students. So I think your data about how important that is will be greatly valuable as they continue to do their advocacy around that. And so I think there are a bunch of policy interventions that our parents that really actually correlate and perfectly relate to what our parents have been talking about for a long time. And this just arms them with, again, the information that they need to make those changes at the systems level.
Fantastic. Ivan, sort of similar question to you as a district leader. Are there things within this report that you hope school and district leaders can take away?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think we've learned a lot around what assessments can look like. I definitely will say that we've been really exploring the idea around mastery-based learning, competency-based demonstration of student learning. And so I think there's this opportunity to really think about how we break things from being so everything just is so segmented right now, where you have reading here, you have writing here, you have math here. And I think there's this opportunity to really try to bring things together for our students. I know in conversations that I've had with our students, a lot of our students talk about going from box to box to box, and they're constantly trying to spend time trying to make connections to what they're learning. So I think, for both district leaders and school leaders, we have a really unique opportunity to really be thinking about how do we make learning make more sense for students? How do we make more connections for students? How do we key in more with like project-based learnings or opportunities for students to be able to really think differently around how they learn, so they can then demonstrate in a different way? I know it will take more time to measure that type of learning, but I think it's what our students are really asking for. And it's something I think we need to spend a lot more time thinking about our instructional approaches to supporting our students in our schools.
Thank you. Thank you for that. My last sort of teed up question, then we're getting some in the chat, and some of these are sort of related, I think, but I would love to get each of your perspectives on what do we think, or what does this report mean, or if you think it means anything, for the federal role in data and accountability going forward, as a tool for the field or for policymakers, and similarly state role, local role, if you see one. Dan, do you want to start?
Sure, and I just want to say two caveats here. This obviously gets into the realm of speculation, and I'm not a political scientist, so I come at this with some humbleness in answering this question. Hopefully humbleness just generally, but so I guess my reaction is that it's tempting to kind of move on from accountability and a federal role, and I think it's a mistake, as we've all sort of hinted at, to sort of treat the world as things worked or they didn't work, so we've got to abandon what we've done. I think there's a real federal role for an information infrastructure. In fact, we know a ton more about the way that teachers and schools impact the long run outcomes of students because of the role that the federal government started to take more than 20 years ago. So that information infrastructure is important. I also think that the role to push innovations is quite important. When it comes to sort of like, do we think about pressures from the federal government or the state or localities? I'm more agnostic, but I would say that just kind of casual observation is that it's challenging politically sometimes to do things at a more local level. And sometimes it's better to be able to say, hey, I don't want to do this, but those folks up the food chain are making me. And just as an example, there's pretty good evidence that teachers are inequitably distributed across students. I used to serve on a school board. I think it's hard to do things that move teachers around or create incentives to keep teachers in schools where they might want to move out of, and that it's helpful to have somebody up the food chain saying, no, we're going to at least make you pay attention locality at the distribution of teachers in your local school district. And I think you could make the same argument that there are important areas where states need to be held accountable by the feds for at least reporting out to parents and being transparent about the way that education is functioning in the state.
Really important insights. Chris, Ivan, Maya, do you want to weigh in on this federal, state, local role?
So I'll jump in, and practicing the same amount of humility as Dan did. I'm not a political scientist either. Maya said something earlier that actually stuck out to me, that there's really a difference between data and information. And parents at the grassroots level, teachers at the school level, administrators, and even school boards, they need information to drive practice and to drive behavior. But the federal government, I think if they have any role, it's to be like the best, most honest data broker.
Yeah.
The one that collects the most information, or the most data, I'm sorry, that collects the most data and actually distributes that data so that states can actually turn it into information for their states. And information, I mean, data is how you know the world. Information is what it drives you to do and what it motivates you to do for your people. So I think there needs to be a way more robust, fair, and honest role for the federal government to collect data and to share data, and for states to take that and turn that into information that can be used to drive for superintendents, to drive school districts, to drive individual schools, and to drive parent action.
I
Ivan?
double tap on everything that both Dan and Chris said. I think one of the things that's just hugely important is that we have a period right now where we know that the inequities are growing between groups of people in our country, right? We had huge inequities before the pandemic, and those inequities have only grown post-pandemic. And I think one of the best things that we could say came out of NCLB, ESSA, was that we put a focus on disaggregated data and understanding how different subgroups of students were doing. And that is something our parents have reiterated time and time again, is that if it wasn't for that, they wouldn't know that students with disabilities sometimes in some of our schools and some of our districts, none of them are performing on grade level. That's not acceptable. And at least with that data, parents had the information to say, this isn't right. And we hadn't been doing that before. And that was something that really came out in the report in terms of how we switched to be able to focus on how different populations were doing. But agreeing with Chris and with Dan that data isn't the same thing as the information and what that information looks like in terms of implementation on the ground. I think when you're talking about the federal government's role, it's to bring that data to light, to make sure that we are setting expectations about what data we want and who we want it for, so that then at the state and the local level, you can now start to think about what the implementation looks like and which populations, even at the smaller local level, you're serving, and how do you need to think about the implementation to get those resources to kids, and which interventions work best for the populations that you're serving, and where you can prioritize, right? Building entire improvement plans, not just for schools and not just for districts, but for states, right? So I think that is really where, when we talk to parents, they would love to see a difference. They don't think that the disaggregated data and the way in which we did getting that data out was wrong. It's the second step that we really missed in terms of the implementation and the information piece that has to happen at the local and state level in terms of thinking about what implementation looks like and what do we do with the information that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to bring in this question from the audience because it's related. And Ivan, I'll toss it to you. Who truly carries the burden of improving accountability and assessments in K-12 education? Is it teachers, administrators, policymakers, maybe all?
Yeah, I think I'll take this from something really local and personalized here in our districts, that we're in the middle of doing some strategic plan refreshing. And so we've been having these strategic advisory groups meeting that's part of, teachers and school leaders and district leaders having really good conversations. And just last week with our high school teachers, we were talking about accountability. And one of the things that our teachers were talking about, this accountability has just put so much pressure on them that they get really worried, when they deviate from curriculum or deviate from some of the standards when they're trying to meet the needs of students. And so, I definitely feel that our teachers have carried a lot of the burden around this. And then on top of that is, sorry about that. Keto is ready to come in. So, apart from that, also, I would just say that I feel like schools and districts really carry that burden. I was part of a state and a school district where schools were labeled as low performing from red, orange, yellow, green, and blue. And, if you were a red school for 2 years, you may have been considered for closing. And so ultimately that burden fell on the community, that burden fell on families. And I just remember seeing, the sadness and the grief, when schools are being considered for closure. So I definitely say that it's our schools and our communities that really carry the burden, because policymakers don't get labeled as red, as failing. It's schools, and that gets carried on by school leaders, that gets carried on by teachers and our students.
Does anybody else on the panel have a different view or have a different, if not, I can move on to another question.
I mean, I would argue it needs to be everybody. And the reason that I say that is that in the report, one of the most interesting things you guys had in there was about how, with a lot of that information, people decided how they wanted to vote. They decided where they wanted to move, right? If we think about the importance of schools in our communities, they are literally where people decide whether or not they're going to buy a house, raise a family, continue to contribute to and grow our economy. Think about who they want to put in office. If that's the case, and that's the lever that schools have in our system, then who has to be responsible for how schools are doing has to be everyone. Now, I think the question is, what does that look like? It doesn't mean that everybody has the same role inside of having a voice in that system. Different people can bring different skills and talents and different viewpoints. And I think one of the things we have a hard time with a lot of times when we think about it as that macro is like, how do we make sure all of those voices are represented? How do we do that? But I don't think that we should not actually try to get there just because it's hard. I actually think that that is the answer, because this is how everyone, even every single one of us as panelists on this call, are probably making decisions about where we live, how we engage in our community, how we engage as citizens based upon the schools in our neighborhood. That's a huge, huge piece of the puzzle. And so we all need to be a part of making those decisions about how we're making them better.
And even if we don't know that we're making those decisions, we are, because there's evidence connecting school quality to the value of real estate. So school quality has these broad ramifications that go beyond even having kids in public schools in the moment.
So, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Dr. Ivan or Dr. Duran, the last point that he made, I think is a really good one, though. How come there is no upward accountability? I mean, schools get rated, teachers get rated. I agree with Maya that it should be everybody. There's a role for everybody to play. It shouldn't be one group that gets it. But we don't rate governors or state houses or decision makers and lawmakers on the performance of the schools, even though they rate everybody else on it. And I just don't know. I don't know a novel way to make that happen anytime soon other than elections. But I do think it's a good idea or a good question to keep raising. How come we don't have upward accountability for the performance of the schools too?
I think you're making a case for us to bring back our leaders and laggards report, which was a bit of a grading on states and policymakers at the state level on how their K-12 education systems were doing, and it wasn't often pretty. So maybe we need to resurrect that. We've got one question for Dan specifically. I'm curious about the data showing a positive impact from NCLB, but no impact from Common Core. The timelines overlap. So how can the data show both things?
Yeah, this is a good question, and it speaks to the data infrastructure and also the timelines for what we're looking at. So a lot of the studies about NCLB were looking at the timing of state implementation of reforms and the contrast between the kind of accountability that existed before NCLB in a state and the kind of accountability that was required after NCLB was implemented, to see if you saw that contrast led to differential student achievement gains. So that's sort of the design of that kind of study. And similarly, Common Core, there are sort of leading states in Common Core and more lagging states in Common Core, but the Common Core implementation really was happening, in the decade after NCLB implementation. So you could actually find differential effects across those two federal initiatives.
Thank you, Dan. And shockingly, we're over time now. And so I'm going to wrap up, and I'm going to say thank you to all of you for being here today, for everything you have contributed to this effort over the past, I don't know, it's been like 18 months now. Dan and Mike, Chris and your team at Brightbeam, Ivan, Maya, and everybody on the work group. We just could not have done this without you all. I want to encourage everybody who's on and listening, or who will listen to this recording, to actually read the report. And you can, there'll be a QR code when I finish up here where you can scan. There it is. You can also go to uschamberfoundation.org. Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for participating today. Have a good afternoon.